David Greygoose is the pen name of writer and poet Dave Ward. Born in Northampton, he attended Lancaster University, where he was involved with Adrian Mitchell's Song Workshop and took over the editorship of Continuum Arts magazine and the promotion of guest poetry readings through the Literature Society. He also staged a number of multimedia events. In 1970, he came to live in Liverpool, working first at the Great George's Project and then Halewood Community Council before going on to establish the Windows Project in 1976, coordinating writing workshops in the community and educational venues across Merseyside and the Northwest. His published work includes Candy and Jazz, Jambo, The Tree of Dreams, as well as poetry collections, Tracts, and On the Edge of Rain. His poetry has appeared in over 100 anthologies, including Faber, Puffin, Macmillan, and Hodder and Stoughton. And he's been broadcast on BBC 2 television, Granada TV, as well as on BBC Radio 1, 2, and 4. His latest book is Brunt Boggart, and it's described as a tapestry of folk tales, myths, and storytelling. The connecting thread follows Grey Child, abandoned in the woods by his mother. David Greygoose joins us on this edition of Arts Alive Books to tell us more. Welcome to Arts Alive Books. And David, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Or should I say Dave?
Well, just to clear that one up, I'm Dave Ward, and as Dave Ward, I've run the Windows project since 1976. David Greygoose is a pen name that I've used frequently. In fact, some of my poems are published in one anthology as Dave Ward and another anthology as David Greygoose, just to confuse literary historians in years to come. But Greygoose is more than a pen name, it's my great-grandmother's maiden name.
Oh, wow.
And in a way, that's part of what Brunt Boggart is about, is who are we, where do we come from? So if you took the mother's line of names, then I am Greygoose.
Of course, yeah. Well, we'll come on and talk about the book in a moment because it's a fascinating read and a brilliant prospect. But a little bit about the Windows project, first of all.
Yes, well, as I say, we started in 1976 running writing workshops on Merseyside Play Action Council's play schemes, founded with Dave Calder, who's now resident in Glasgow. The very first workshop we did in '76 had Carol Ann Duffy and Libby Houston on board as well.
That's coming up to nearly 40 years ago, you know that.
It's 40 years next year, so we're thinking about events that we might do next year. Since then, we've expanded just because we received the invitations to expand. It was never an intention to suddenly make it bigger and bigger and bigger, because often that doesn't work. But we got more and more invitations to do things in different communities. So we went on to work in youth clubs and libraries, day centres. We've taken on a whole range of writers and artists over the years. So we've got about 35 freelancers who undertake work for us at the moment.
Well, it sounds like a brilliant project, and I'm sure many of the viewers will have kind of encountered it in some form or other over those 39, nearly 40 years.
Yeah.
But of course, you're also a writer, a poet, and so it's really that we want to talk about, and particularly the book, Brunt Boggart.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this.
Oh, well, there's lots of starting points. The idea of doing the stories had been festering, mulching for at least 10 years, because I remember I was on tour in Singapore and writing notes about it in a hotel bedroom, and then 10 years later I was doing another tour in China with a piece called Tree of Dreams, which is also a David Greygoose concoction. I was in Harbin in northern China, near the Russian border. I was being shown around by two students who took me to a Buddhist temple, and we heard the monks singing. We looked at the 20, 40-foot high statue of Buddha, and then they said, you can get a free meal here. If you're a traveller, we are travellers, you can get a free meal. I said, that's fine, never refuse a free meal. And we sat down, and normally before eating I would always wash my hands, and I didn't spot anywhere to wash my hands, and I thought, well, I'm in a temple, I'm a guest. And then I saw a rat scurry across the floor and thought nothing of it. And the next day woke up with horrendous food poisoning in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. Looked out the window and I thought there'd been a military takeover, because at 5 o'clock in the morning the campus was full of people in uniform. It slowly dawned on me, A, that it was actually obligatory military manoeuvres that all the students have to do at the end of term. The thunderstorm went away, but I realised I got the food poisoning. So for the next 4 days, I had nothing to eat, little sips of water. Had to go down to Beijing to get the plane home. Woke up again with a massive thunderstorm going on, and on a piece of paper wrote, write the stories. Went back to sleep, got up, went to the airport, got on the plane, as most people do, dozed off. And I woke up with the words in my head of the opening of the book being told to me in the narrator's voice that I'd been looking for. And I think the reason I'm telling you that is I think to write, it's not only a discipline and a craft, but sometimes indeed an element of disorientation to release something in your brain. And when I got back, I couldn't stop writing them.
Can you tell us a little bit quickly about the kind of the world, the landscape, the environment that is Brunt Boggart?
Well, Brunt Boggart is an imagined village where the people live close to the land. They're very in touch with the elements. I began to realise that there were certain rules or even non-rules. As I was writing it, I realised there was no hierarchy. There was no leader of the village. Or Thunderhead is, but he's seriously ill and is trying to cure himself. One of the stories is called Thunderhead and the 5 Cures. There are no teachers, there are no schools, there is no church mentioned. And by their absence, it just seemed these are people who are able to organise their lives and farm. And then there is the link to the city of Arlecra along the Peddlerman's track, and the Peddlerman arrives every full moon, and moons became very important. We deliberately published it earlier this week on May the 4th, not because it was the bank holiday, but because it was the full moon. And so one of the characters, Greychild, sets off down the Peddlerman's track to find his missing mother. 2 of the other characters follow him, so Ravenhair and Crossdogs also make the same journey, and then they arrive in the city separately and have different encounters in the city. And indeed, in the city meet some of the characters from the village who have migrated and their lives have been changed by city life.
So it's a kind of fantasy novel in some senses. It's set in a kind of imagined world, but yet it's got some kind of recognisable parameters from our world. Influenced to a certain extent, I suppose, by your own background or by your own interests.
Well, yes. I mean, again, it became a deliberate mythologising of my own life. I grew up in Towcester, which is a market town in Northampton, so it's at the hub of a rural community. I spent a lot of time walking and cycling around farms as a boy, and now I realise I've got a lot of knowledge and a lot of description that came to me quite naturally when I was writing it.
Yeah. And the book's been launched later in the week, is that right? At a special event in the Blue Coat?
Next week, May the 13th, at the Blue Coat. It'll be launched with a film that's been specially made by First Take, filmed in meticulous detail by Jane. I took her to places that I'm familiar with, and she found things there that I'd never seen before. So it was filmed in and around Hale Wood, Hale Bank, but also up in Formby Woods, which Jane's familiar with. And it has some stunning music by 3 leading folk musicians. So we have Giles Lewin from the Carnival Band and Hannah James from Lady Masery, who both work regularly with Maddie Pryor, so we're very privileged to have them, and Emily Portman, BBC Folk Award winner, who's just released her 3rd CD, has wonderfully performed the Coddle Me song, which is a key part of the story.
Well, it sounds like a brilliant event.
And they'll be playing live as well, not just on the soundtrack, they'll be there playing live.
Yeah. It sounds great. Well, we're going to leave it there for the time being.
Okay.
Stay with us for part 2, when David will be talking about one of his favourite books, the English fairy tales. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please contact us at artsalivebooks@baytvliverpool.com, and we look forward to hearing from you. David Greygoose joins us again. Earlier in the show, we spoke about David's new book, Brunt Boggart. First Take in Liverpool are creating a film based on elements from the book to convey the mood and mystery of the village of Brunt Boggart. Emily Portman has recorded her own beautiful version of the Coddle Me song.
Coddle me, my darling son. I'm leaving you here till the crying is done. Coddle me, my darling son. I'm leaving you here till the crying is done. Back in the village they'll look at you strange, but here in the forest you're safe from their gaze. Coddle me, my darling son. I'm leaving you here till the crying is done. I'll bring you sweet milk and I'll fetch you fresh bread. The trees are your chamber, green moss is your bed. Coddle me, my darling son. I'm leaving you here till the crying is done. Coddle me, my darling son. I'm leaving you here till the crying is done.
In a few moments, David is going to be telling us about one of the books that influenced him, is English fairy tales. Before that, though, he's going to read a short extract from his book, Brunt Boggart.
This is from the story called Snuffwidget and the Crow Dancers. It's from still in the village sequence. The field was filled with a fever of poppies, red as boar's blood, swaying and beckoning. In the corner beside a stricken tree crouched the figure of the hooded drummer, his long hands moving in a blur of shadows, beating out the pulsing rhythm under the blackened branches. Snuffwidget watched as the dancers moved around the field, plucking the heads from wafting poppies, smearing their petals across their faces, across their arms and over their bodies, stuffing the redness into their mouths, choking on the heady nectar until the petals dribbled out again. Snuffwidget watched, then joined the dancers, joined their swirling dervish dance, a frenzy trance, driven by the rhythm of the crouching drummer in the corner of the echo field. Then, one by one, the dancers stumbled, tumbled into the arms of the waiting ditch. The drumbeat slowed, slowed to walking, slowed to heartbeat. Dark crows flapped across the fields, shadows black against the scarlet poppies. They sat in lines along the fences, perched on thorn bushes, massed on hedge tops, ranged along the branches of the fever tree. Their heads nodded in time to the rhythm of the drummer as his hands beat slower, slower than breathing, slower than dreaming. Then the drumbeat stopped and the dark crows rose, spiraling high then swirling downwards, lower and lower till they plunged to the ditch where the dancers lay.
Thank you. That's beautiful. One of the things that kind of strikes me about it immediately, and certainly when I was reading the book itself, was the rhythm of the voice, the narrative voice, which is especially interesting in relation to a passage like that because drums kind of feature in as part of the story itself.
Well, there's a rhythm going through it. I mean, the other thing, having dreamt the opening on an aeroplane, almost all the stories were written on Mersey Travel train between Hunts Cross Station and Central Station. You get 18 minutes, so it focuses the mind wonderfully. But there is a sort of rhythm of travelling.
Yeah.
And I was aware on a good morning, if I hit that rhythm, it was a good morning. Sometimes you just ramble on and you have to edit it afterwards. But and it's very language rich, and I make no compromises about that. I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, it's got to be fast and pacey." Well, no, not this one hasn't. No. There's other things I can write that can be fast and pacey, but this one ain't.
I think your alternative career as a poet is certainly evident in a passage like that as well. The kind of the choice of words.
Oh, you weigh every word.
Yeah.
I've been shocked occasionally reading novels by well-known writers. And I think that's a bit slack, that bit, because they're keeping the story moving, whereas a poet, it's the image, it's every word.
So tell us a little bit about this book, the English Fairy Tales.
This is a book called English Fairy Tales. I don't know how it came into my possession. I found it in the house. I assume I may have bought it in a second-hand bookshop, but I can't remember doing that.
Sounds like the beginning of a novel, actually.
Yeah, it's not one that my father gave me. It hasn't got a name in it. And I picked it up one day and looked at it, and I thought, well, this will be interesting because probably this will be the original story of Cinderella and classic tales like that. And I opened the introduction and it said, no, these are not European tales, they are English tales. Most of them are not ones that are in current use. There's one or two in there that people would be familiar with, but lots of them, and they've got very resonant names, and just the whole atmosphere of it fascinated with me. And that was years before having the thought that I wanted to write these stories of my own, but I think it stayed in the background, the atmosphere of it. Yeah. I mean, there are some titles. It doesn't have a year of publication, which is frustrating.
And it doesn't seem to have an editor either.
It's prefaced by Joseph Jacobs, but there are characters such as Molly Whoopie. There's something called the Red Eton. There's the Hobbyars, Tom Hickathrift, Gobbin Seer. I mean, they're all just names to conjure with. There are precious few kings, queens, princes. Again, that's something I avoided in Brunt Bogger. It's a sort of shorthand. A lot of fairy tales when the main character is a princess. I think it's not that they wanted to be a princess, but it's an archetype. It's any person, and it's a shorthand to say, well, it could be you, but for some reason they make it a princess.
There's an interesting issue to do with the process of narration that we've already spoken about. So far as I presume, most of these would have been originally oral tales.
Yes.
And so you've got to try, once you transpose them into a kind of literary idiom or mode, you've got to think about that voice, don't you? Which was, was very evident in your book from the outset, that you thought very closely about who was telling these stories, what was the context, and so on.
I think in the preface it does talk a bit about that, because I think it's been done by someone carefully. They are aware that they're transposing an oral tradition, and often in very strong dialects that it would be either hard to write down. I mean, I've read books of folk tales and they've retained the dialect to the extent that they're almost impenetrable. And yes, that's authentic, but it makes them hard to read. So I think I feel it's correct when a writer, I mean, Kevin Crossley Holland does this, and Kevin Crossley Holland was another of the starting points for Brunt Bogger. I had a very long conversation with him, and that sort of triggered that off. So retellings of tales, because they've always been retold, so the language will shift and change and grow.
Yeah. Definitely, and also this idea of kind of making a world. I mean, I noticed that it's called English fairy tales rather than English folk tales. They seem to be kind of bedded in a kind of imaginary England to a certain extent, like your book.
Something about that in the preface, and he explains why. He says, well, children will tend to ask for fairy tales, not folk tales, but I think more properly it's folk tales. But part of the problem is that, like many things, the notion of fairies has become sanitized and Disneyized. I mean, they're fierce creatures. They're fierce stories. There's stuff in there that's darker than a lot of things you see on television now.
There certainly is, yeah. I've read some of these, and a lot of them they speak to a kind of that kind of eeriness that we were discussing earlier on, the eeriness of the landscape.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks very much for coming in, Dave Ward and David Greygoose. And thank you for tuning in, and see you on the next edition of Arts Alive Books. Good night.